Good evening, time travelers and urchins of the galaxy. Today we're going to talk about, most appropriately for a time travel site, the future. I thought it would be good to start off this broadcast with some quotes about the future taken from the past. The year was 1880, and Alexander Graham Bell, who got to the patent office ahead of Mr. Gray, Alexander Graham Bell said, "One day there will be a telephone in every major city in the USA." All right, Mr. Bell, very good. This is from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1900. I don't know who John Alfred Watkins is. I can look him up at some other point in time. But he said, by the year 2000, every river or creek with any suitable fall will be equipped with water motors, turning dynamos, making electricity. I think one of the things that we look at when we look at the future is we judge the future with exactly the way the world is right now. This one is from Scientific American, and I talked about it in one of my books called Sojourn. They made a bold prediction in 1920. Electricity transmission by wireless may be commercially feasible. 1920, Scientific American. What happened? Didn't quite work out that way. All right, now we're back in 1896. And this is J. Raleigh, a leading British physicist. "I have not the smallest molecule of faith in aerial navigation other than ballooning." Okay, Steven Spielberg, 1985, predicting Google glasses. Hovering skateboards. We also had the advent of Skype. Marshall Folk in France, 1912. "Aircraft are interesting toys, but of no military value." Okay. David Sarnoff, who became one of the huge promoters and controllers of radio. In the 1920s, he had a little bit different view of the situation. "The wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for such a message sent to nobody in particular?" Okay, Mr. Sarnoff, perhaps you were a little bit behind the times, but I'm sure you caught up with it as you took over the entire radio networks. Lee DeForest, why theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially, I consider it an impossibility, a development on which we need waste little time dreaming. Again, he's taking the situation in 1926, and not just the technical situation, but let's look at the population, the advancement and the ability to get televisions manufactured, things like that. The entire situation starts ballooning outward as you go ahead in time, and it's almost impossible, unless you're very, very good, to predict what's going to happen. Film mogul Darrell F. Zanuck, 1946, with a vested interest in movies and cinema. "Television won't be able to hold on to any market it captures after the first 6 months. People will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night." I don't think so. Harry Bruno, aviation publicist, 1943, so you can see where he's coming from before I even say this quote. "Automobiles will start to decline as soon as the last shot is fired in World War II. Instead of a car in every garage, there'll be a helicopter." Well, I'm going to take you back in time now, back to UMass Amherst, when Issac Asimov blew into town. Now, I was very excited about seeing Dr. Asimov because I had read his books and because I had read a lot of his articles in scientific journals, and to see somebody of his caliber was just incredible. But he's also very funny, and certainly for the students that were in that audience, the impressionable students, including myself, had a very different view. Dr. Issac Asimov here in 2015 as opposed to many years ago at UMass Amherst. So I'm going to take you back to 1978, and here is Dr. Asimov telling us why, what gives him the qualifications to talk about predictions of the future, exactly what we're talking about here tonight.
The reason I'm here, however, is to predict the future. And it is very likely that you'll want to know what gives me the right to predict the future, right? I mean, what are my qualifications? So I'll tell you what my qualifications to predict the future are. My chief qualification took place in 1952 when I found myself in Chicago. I found myself in Chicago because I had to address the American Chemical Society, which was a thankless task. I discussed some experiments of mine and got very few laughs. So I decided to visit the offices of a small science fiction magazine called Universe Science Fiction. At any rate, I had to think of something fast because I was ashamed to say that I didn't have the slightest idea of what to write. And thinking quickly, I wrote a story called Everest, because Everest was much in the news then. And I thought that since 7 expeditions had failed, that I might as well write a little story about why expeditions failed, and I explained it by saying that the abominable snowmen were Martians. And they kept human travelers off the top. She read the story, bought it on the spot for $30. I spent half of it in a dinner for her and me. In those days, you could buy a very good dinner for $15 and got nowhere. Went home, a sadder and wiser man, and forgot about it until the next May 30th, 1953, when somebody to whom I hadn't done a darn thing, named Edmund Hillary, and his Sherpa sidekick, Tenzing Norgay, climbed Mount Everest, and at 11:30 a.m. stood at the very tippy-tip top, they said. And, well, who was there to check up, you know? And that instantly placed Universe Science Fiction in a very, very strange ethical dilemma. If they published the story, they would make me look like a fool, and if they didn't publish the story, they would lose $30. And it took them a second and a quarter to decide to publish. And they did. They published in the December 1953 issue, so that there is my record as a predictor of the future. I'm the only man living who ever predicted that Mount Everest would never be climbed 5 months after. I will now talk about the future. Because as the result of actually learning what caused infectious disease, we gradually learned how to take measures that minimized infectious disease, helped cure it if it was caught, and eventually, through the conquest of infectious disease, we doubled the lifespan of the human being from an average of perhaps 35 to an average in the more, quote, advanced, unquote, nations of perhaps 70, so that every one of us lives twice as long as he would have lived if he had lived, say, 120 years ago, which is nice. Most people don't object to that. But it does leave us with a population explosion, because, as a matter of fact, what governs the Earth's population is the birth rate and the death rate. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the population goes up. Or, if you want to look at it another way, if the death rate is lower than the birth rate, the population goes up. And vice versa. If the birth rate is lower than the death rate, or the death rate is higher than the birth rate, have I got it all straight? Doesn't matter. It's a college audience. I say what I please, and you sort it out because you know what I mean. And we've got to go back to that birth rate, death rate business. There are only 2 ways of handling an expanding population if you think that it's dangerous, and if you want to establish population stability or even reduce the population to a reasonable level. There are only 2 ways to do it. You can either raise the death rate until it's higher than the birth rate, or you can lower the birth rate until it's lower than the death rate. Fortunately, those are the only 2 ways. Fix it so that everyone gets his fair share. Fix it so that governments are sane and don't do things that are stupid. Fix it that people are honest and unselfish and share with each other. Fix it that the economic system is honest and trade is efficient and everybody works decently, and if pigs had wings, they would fly. But even if that happened, in about 40 years, there'll be 8 billion people on Earth. And if you've managed to keep up with that, in 40 years more, there'll be 16 billion people on Earth. And in a little while, 250 years to be exact, the total number of population on Earth will be such that the average density will be 100,000 per square mile. Now, 100,000 per square mile is something that's easily described for those of you who have ever been in Manhattan at lunch hour. That's it. I'm there every lunch hour. I know exactly what it looks like. People all over the streets, wall to wall, with lots more hidden in the skyscrapers. Only in nice places like the Berkshires. But in Greenland, Antarctica, the Himalayan mountains, the Sahara Desert, and if you'll throw planks across the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, on them too. And you have the feeling that you're going to have one world-girdling skyscraper, partially apartment houses, partially factories, partially all kinds of things, schools, colleges. No more caterpillars, no more nothing except human beings, and of course, they can't live on something which has waste. This is not exactly such a good world, but maybe if we manage to make it, we'll be used to it. And we'll say, this is great, except that in 40 years more, the population density of the Earth will be 200,000 per square mile. Obviously, in a relatively short time, like for instance 3,000 years, the total weight of flesh and blood will be equal to the total weight of the Earth. And in 9,000 years, it'll be equal in total weight of the known universe. So, let's face it. Sooner or later, we'll have to stop. We can't not do anything. The difficulty is, of course, that there is supposed to be 60 billion barrels of oil in the ground, 600 billion barrels of oil in the ground, and we're consuming 30 billion barrels a year, 20 billion barrels a year. If you divide 600 billion by 20 billion and you keep the zeros straight, the answer is 30, which means that at the present rate of use, we've got enough oil to last us 30 years, and after that we're in trouble. There's plenty more energy, but we're geared. The Earth is geared to the use of oil, which is by all odds the cheapest and most convenient energy source we've ever had. To develop other energy sources is going to mean a capital investment, and it's going to mean a lot of maintenance and a lot of research and a lot of trouble. So what we ought to do is start going through all this trouble and all this expense and all this effort and all this emotional turmoil right now, and conserve our fossil fuels as much as we can so as to give us as much lead time as possible. And this is going to be difficult, and the only thing in its favor is that it may save civilization for those of you who think it's worth saving. For those of you who don't, you might recall that if you don't save it, we lose several billion lives the world over, of which your own may be one. And if you still don't think that's important, then you're fortunate. Nothing can happen to you that's important. To be able to look at the universe and wonder what it is and what it's like and how best to cooperate with it to expand. It is different parts of the universe becoming aware of itself. And it doesn't matter what the outward shape of the self-awareness is, only its function, that of self-awareness. And when we can join the brotherhood of intelligence at last, we will know that the human species is finally adult. Thank you very much.